Was JFK a ladies' man on an extraordinary scale? One of the, and I mean this in a medical sense, one of the sickest presidents in American history. Did JFK save the world from nuclear Armageddon? Yes, along with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader. Hello, I am Mark White, Professor of History at Queen Mary University of London. I've worked for many years on John Kennedy and the Kennedy presidency, and indeed I just have a book coming out this autumn called Icon, Libertine, Leader, which addresses the major questions concerning Kennedy. And I'm going to be talking to you about the most Googled questions on John F. Kennedy. So the first question is, what was JFK's full name? It was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Who were the Kennedys? The Kennedys were the most important political dynasty in American history since World War II. They were of Irish-American ancestry, hailing from New England, from Massachusetts. And if you look at the United States in 1963, for example, you have one Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who was President of the United States. You have another Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, who was Attorney General of the United States, and truth be told, second most powerful man in America. And you have a third brother, Edward Kennedy, who was Senator for Massachusetts. So the most important political family in the United States since World War II, often referred to as America's royal family, which is a term which goes back to John Kennedy's inauguration as president on the 20th of January 1961. Who were JFK's parents? JFK's parents were Joseph Kennedy and Rose Kennedy, and our understanding of his relationship with them has changed a lot over the years. The emotional reality was he was closer to his dad than his mother. His dad's really important in the story of John F. Kennedy. He makes a fortune on the unregulated stock market of the 1920s. By the 1930s, he's one of the 10 richest men in America. That money will be very important when John Kennedy runs for political office. Also in the 1920s, Joe Kennedy became a Hollywood producer. So at a very early stage, he developed a very strong sense of the importance of image and how to handle the media, and that is something he bequeathed to his son John F. Kennedy, who as president had incredible skill at promoting a seductive image and at dealing with the media. In terms of Rose Kennedy, she was a housewife, she didn't have a career, she was very, very religiously devout, but also very interested in fashion, but she also had an important political pedigree. Her father, who was known as Honey Fitzgerald, had been mayor of Boston, so that was a really important sort of political factor in terms of JFK's rise. Was JFK Irish? He was of Irish ancestry, so complete Irish ancestry. His ancestors had come over in the 19th century, and it was always something he was massively proud of. And in 1963, as president, he did a tour of several European countries, including Ireland. And the thing he enjoyed the most by a mile was the time he spent in Ireland. Interestingly, although he's from one of the richest families in America, he went to elite prep schools, he went to Harvard, he always had this sense of being something of an outsider. And I think that's because of his Irish Catholic background. In the 1920s in America, for example, there was tremendous prejudice against Irish Catholics, and that was something he was conscious of. So his ancestry is Irish. Did JFK nearly die before becoming president? Yes. At least on 2 occasions. He's one of the, and I mean this in a medical sense, one of the sickest presidents in American history. Had 3 massive problems in particular, lots of others as well. Diagnosed with colitis in the 30s, diagnosed with Addison's disease in the late 1940s. That's when your adrenal gland doesn't work properly, doesn't produce enough adrenaline, and also massive spinal problems. He was read the last rites on at least 2 occasions. One when he was diagnosed with Addison's disease in the late 1940s, so very close to death there. And secondly, he had major spinal surgery in 1954, and so close to death's door on at least 2 occasions. And really on a 3rd occasion as well, and that's in World War II. He served in the Navy. His boat PT-109 was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. 2 of his crewmates died, so at least on 3 occasions, in fact, very close to death. Was JFK wealthy? Yes, extremely wealthy, and that's due to his father, who made an absolute fortune in the 1920s. On Wall Street. He actually said, I need to make this money as fast as I can before they make this illegal. And he allegedly did things like import liquor into the United States, which was illegal at that time because of prohibition, but he made an absolute fortune. But he wanted to do it in part so that his children didn't have to worry about money and could go into public service. And at dinner conversations, when John Kennedy was a kid, that's what they spoke about. They spoke about public issues. So when he's an adult, he never has to worry about money. He doesn't have to think about making it. All the Kennedy children have trust funds. What's interesting though is when he used to go around, when he used to socialise, go for dinner with friends, he never had any money in his pockets. So his mates always used to have to pick up the tab. Was JFK a veteran? Yes, he was. He served in World War II. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in late 1941, as with a lot of Americans, upper class, middle class, as well as working class, he wanted to serve. He managed to get into the Navy, despite the fact that he had major spinal problems. He probably shouldn't have been allowed in, but he was. And he's put in charge of these light craft called PT boats, popular with people who are from Kennedy's social background, who did a lot of sailing. So he's in charge of this boat PT 109. And in the summer of 1943 in the Pacific, the boat is rammed by a Japanese destroyer. And the boat splits in two, 2 of the crew die. And he does perform, there's quite a lot of controversy over it, partly because General Douglas MacArthur said he shouldn't have received military honours for the way he handled that issue, which he did in the end. He should have been court-martialed for allowing his boat to be rammed by a Japanese destroyer. In fact, I think he behaved really heroically in saving his crew. He had to swim very large distances. He had to show ingenious leadership. So this is 3 years before he's elected to office, but he is known as a military hero, and that will be very, very useful to him politically.
My fellow Americans, this is a problem which faces us all, in every city of the North as well as the South.
What accent did JFK have? That's actually a really good question. He had a very strong kind of Boston accent, very, very distinctive, kind of easy to mimic.
I thought he was a macho, womanizing stud who conquered the moon!
Yeah, and one American comedian did, Vaughn Meader, who put out a comedy record during Kennedy's presidency in which he took off Kennedy's accent and the other Kennedys as well. So it's a very, very distinctive accent. Was JFK a Democrat or a Republican? He's a Democrat. The family were Democrats. That was the political tradition in that family. He's a Democrat. Was JFK the youngest president ever? It's actually an interesting question because I think a lot of people think he was. He wasn't. The youngest president ever was Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Republican. He was Vice President of the United States, and the incumbent president, William McKinley, was assassinated in 1901. It catapults Theodore Roosevelt into the presidency. But John Kennedy is the youngest ever elected president, and that is still the case today. No presidential candidate has been elected when younger than John Kennedy. He was 43 at the time of the 1960 election. Was JFK a good president? It's a really controversial issue. For a decade or so after he was assassinated, which was in November 1963, most people who wrote on him thought he was not just a good president, but a great president. Another Abraham Lincoln, another Franklin Roosevelt, someone who'd fought for equal rights in terms of civil rights, and someone who had managed the Cold War very well, not least during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then in the 70s, there were all sorts of revelations about him in terms of his private life, namely that he'd been a womanizer of spectacular proportions. Also, there were allegations about drug-taking, connections to the mob, and this affected the scholarship. The 3 main books that came out on John Kennedy in the 1980s and 90s were Gary Wills, Thomas Rees, Seymour Hersh, were massively hostile and portrayed him as an aggressive cold warrior and a very, very flawed character. And there have been views articulated in between, so it's a controversial question among historians. My own view is that he was a very good president, and I think you can make a cogent case that he's been the best president since World War II. I don't think you can equate him with, say, Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt. You look at Franklin Roosevelt, president from 1933 to 1945, the only president elected 3 times, the only president elected 4 times, built a welfare state, pulled America out of the Great Depression, defeated fascism, Hitler, won World War II. I don't think you can make the case that Kennedy's accomplishments equal those, but He managed the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War era with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He handled skillfully arguably the second most dangerous crisis of the Cold War era, the Berlin Crisis of 1961. He established the Peace Corps. He excited a lot of people, got them interested in politics, especially a lot of young people. He's the first president in the 20th century to define equal rights for African Americans as a moral issue, not just a legal issue, not just a political issue, but a moral issue, and introduced the Civil Rights Bill in 1963 to end racial segregation. It passed after his death, passed in 1964 as the Civil Rights Act, ending segregation, arguably the single most important piece of legislation in 20th century American history. So I think you can make the case that he's been the most effective, impressive president we've had since World War II. Who was JFK married to? He was married to Jacqueline Bouvier, who would become one of the most iconic first ladies in American history. When you think of the first ladies, the two most important politically were Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's wife, and also Hillary Clinton, who was first lady in the 1990s during the presidency of Bill Clinton, and he put her in charge of his most important domestic reform, which was the attempt to change the healthcare system in the United States. But there have been two other first ladies that have been really, really iconic. One was Michelle Obama, and the other was Jackie Bouvier, Jackie Kennedy. They married in 1953. It was front page news in the papers. It was described as the society wedding of the year. And she has a real impact on his, not only on his life, but on his political career, because she becomes a star in her own right. Even before the Kennedy presidency, she is on the front cover of Life. She is on the front cover of Time magazine. She's attractive, stylish, knows a lot about fashion. She's also extremely cultured. She knows a lot about art, theatre. She speaks several foreign languages. Truth be told, she's far more cultured than JFK. JFK is very intelligent, but she's more cultured and well-rounded. When she becomes First Lady, she famously restores the White House, bringing in pieces of furniture that were historically authentic. The famous social entertainments of the Kennedy presidency, the most famous one being when Pablo Casals, the great cellist, played at the White House. She organised all of those. And what has been described as the biggest cultural event of the Kennedy presidency, which was, it seems incredible looking back, the loaning of the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa, from the Louvre in Paris to the United States, was arranged by her. So she's really important, but she's most important in terms of John Kennedy after his death. Because a week after the assassination, she invites the journalist Theodore White, no relation of mine, to interview her at the Kennedy home in Massachusetts. And it's for Life magazine, which has a readership of millions, exactly 1 week after the assassination. During the interview, she spoke in graphic detail about the assassination, and we have White's notes for that. It's quite gory, and he excluded a lot of that from the article he wrote up for Life. But also during the interview, she mentioned, and it was no accident, this was absolutely planned, she mentioned the fact that on evenings, she and her late husband, John Kennedy, in the White House, liked to listen to a musical record of Camelot. That was a hit musical on Broadway at that time about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Theodore White, being the adroit journalist that he was, wrote up the article emphasising the theme of Camelot, suggesting that John Kennedy had been such a great president, it was appropriate to think of him in mythical terms, in terms of the Arthurian legend. A chivalrous, graceful, inspiring leader. She gave the Kennedy legend a name, Camelot, and did a huge amount, therefore, to ensure that his reputation was sustained after his death. Was JFK a ladies' man? On an extraordinary scale. This was partly due to his father, who was also a philanderer, and not only that, but did it quite openly, and also actually advised his sons to sleep around as much as possible. That was the advice he gave his sons, not his daughters. But for example, he had an affair with Gloria Swanson, maybe the biggest film actress in America in the 1920s. If memory serves, even took her on a cruise with his family, with his wife. And Gloria Swanson said later, either she was, Rose was a fool, or she was a better actress than I was. He partly got it from that. I think he also partly got it, John Kennedy, from all of the ill health that he had, the Addison's disease, the back problems. I think he thought, well, I might not be around a long time, so I might as well enjoy myself as much as I can. and that's what he did. So yeah, his whole life he slept around as much as he could. I mean, probably the most famous relationship he had before his marriage was with Inga Arvid, who was a Danish journalist. He had an affair with her in 1941, 1942 over that winter when he was working in naval intelligence. It's a fascinating affair because she was actually suspected of being a Nazi spy, because she had been, as a journalist working in Europe, in Denmark, she'd been sent to Germany, and she got to know the Nazi top brass. She met the top Nazi leaders. Hitler described her as an example of perfect Nordic beauty, quote unquote, and invited her to a box. So when Kennedy was having that affair with her, the FBI were tapping her phone, intercepting her letters. So when Kennedy becomes president, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, has a huge file on Kennedy. And I think one reason Kennedy doesn't sack Hoover as head of the FBI, although I think he would like to, because he understood Hoover was basically a nefarious, corrupt individual, is because Hoover had this huge file on him. After he marries Jacqueline Kennedy, it makes no difference to his behaviour, and he continues to have affairs. She's aware of that. She's aware of it before she marries him. Yeah, that continues throughout their marriage. When he's president, he has, for example, an affair with a German prostitute, Ellen Romish. He has an affair with Mary Meyer, who's a Bohemian artist. He has an affair with Marilyn Monroe. He's sleeping with at least 4 women who work in the White House. Secretaries, administrators. Yeah, we have the account of one of them, Mimi Alford, because she wrote a memoir on this in fairly recent years. Mimi Beardsley, she was a 19-year-old intern at the time, and JFK took her virginity 4 days after she went to work at the White House in the summer of 1962. What I find interesting is that when all of these revelations about his private life emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, it didn't damage his reputation with the American people. And I think the reason for that is because if you look at Kennedy's image, a key part of it was that he was a sex symbol. And I used to think that was just due to the fact that he was president of the United States, an attractive man, and so, you know, achieved a kind of sex symbol status. But in fact, if you go back to his very first political campaign, which is 1946, when he runs for Congress for a seat in the House of Representatives, if you look at that campaign, even then, there's a huge amount of comment on his physical attractiveness, and he's perceived as a sex symbol even then. So in a way, all the revelations about his private life, that he'd been a playboy, in a sense was consistent with the image that he was a sex symbol. Was JFK popular? This can be answered very specifically because of polling data. He was the most popular president we've had since World War II. His average approval ratings, so the percentage of American people who thought he was doing a good job, average each week whilst he's president, is 70%. Presidents in recent times would have loved to have had a 70% rating in a single week during their presidency. Two other presidents who have high ratings, Dwight Eisenhower and George Bush Sr. actually, but nowhere near as high as Kennedy. So yeah, he's the most popular president in American history. I think you have to say in part that's got to relate to the perceived effectiveness of his political leadership, the way he handles things like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The one really interesting point about that, I think, is that if you look at his popularity and his poll ratings, they do drop during one period, and that is during the last 5 months of his presidency. On the 11th of June 1963, he gives what I think is the most important speech of his presidency, which is on civil rights.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
And after he does that, his ratings in the South plummet. And it's to Kennedy's credit that he made that stance on civil rights, that he introduced the Civil Rights Bill. He was a very shrewd politician, knowing what would happen, which is that he would lose support among some white Southerners at that time, because it's only a year before he's due to run for re-election in 1964. So even though he knows it's going to damage his overall poll ratings, and specifically in the South, he still does it because he thinks it's the right thing. But overall, he is the most popular president the United States has had since World War II. Would JFK have pulled America out of Vietnam? That's such an interesting question, and historians have written so much about it. Basically, His critics say, no, he would have got the United States fully into Vietnam had he lived, been elected to a second term, in which case he would have been president until January 1969. He's assassinated in November 1963. When he becomes president, the US has 600 or 700 military advisors in South Vietnam, but no combat troops, no actual combat troops. By the time he's assassinated in November 1963, that's increased to 16 to 17,000 military advisors, but again, no combat troops. About a year and a half after his assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson, his successor, who has been his vice president, July 65, takes the United States fully into the Vietnam War, and by 1968 there are 500,000 American soldiers in South Vietnam. My own view is that JFK would have avoided a disastrous war in Vietnam, and for a number of reasons. One is his performance in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was seen as a great success, that he stood up to the Russians, diffused the most dangerous crisis in nuclear history in terms of potential for nuclear devastation. So he doesn't need to prove himself in foreign policy in the way that Johnson felt he had to. Also, if you look at the trajectory of his foreign policy during his presidency, he's pretty hard line on the Cold War. The first 2 years, increases military spending, tries to overthrow Fidel Castro at the Bay of Pigs, does escalate US involvement in Vietnam, though he doesn't send troops. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's really concerned about the dangers of the Cold War and the nuclear age. And so in the final year of his presidency, he gives an extraordinary speech at American University in Washington, D.C. on the 10th of June 1963, where he calls on the American people to change their attitude towards the Russian people, to change their attitude towards the Cold War. And he goes on to sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, limiting nuclear testing. If you look at the direction of his foreign policy, it's towards conciliation on the Cold War rather than confrontation. Another factor is he's very suspicious of his military, and that's because he feels that they've misled him, particularly over the Bay of Pigs, which was this disastrous operation he carried out in April 1961, 3 months into his presidency, to overthrow Fidel Castro. The CIA was for it, the generals were for it, and it turned out to be a disaster. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the generals told him to go ahead and bomb Cuba, and he refused to do so. So he's very suspicious of his generals when they tell him basically to take military action, to go to war. So for those reasons and others too, I think JFK would have avoided a disastrous war in Vietnam. Did JFK save the world from nuclear Armageddon? Yes, along with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, and that's because of the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. In spring 1962, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. On the 16th of October 1962, Tuesday the 16th of October 1962, 9 a.m, JFK is lying in bed and his National Security Advisor, George Bundy, comes into the room and tells him, "I need to tell you there are Russian missiles in Cuba, the CIA have just established that." That generates the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. It lasts 13 days. And in the end, John Kennedy, along with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, managed to defuse that crisis. JFK succeeded in standing up to his own hawks, his own generals within his administration who wanted to bomb Cuba. He also kept a commendably open mind on the issue of what to do about this, because on the first day of the crisis, he wanted to bomb Cuba, as did the vast majority of people in his administration. But he kept an open mind, thought about it, reflected, and changed his mind and decided instead to establish a naval blockade around Cuba. I would contrast that with George W. Bush when he decided to go to war against Iraq in 2003 and was given dissenting advice that he just didn't listen to. JFK did and changed his mind. And also in the end, JFK was prepared to make concessions to end the crisis peacefully. Specifically, he promised not to invade Cuba in the future, and also privately he assured the Soviet leader Khrushchev that he would remove US missiles from Turkey. So in all of those ways, he contributed to saving the peace in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did JFK put a man on the moon? In 1961, he vowed to do so and to provide resources to allow the US to achieve that. It is something he's associated with.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
He views it as part of the Cold War contest also. It's not just a visionary thing. He'd like to do that before the Soviets could do it. And it is achieved. It's achieved. In 1969, the United States put a man on the moon. But of course, by this point, John Kennedy has been dead for over half a decade. Did JFK order the CIA to try and assassinate Castro? Well, in the mid-1970s, the United States Senate began an investigation into alleged assassination plots made by the CIA against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro. What it established was that at least 8 assassination plots had been devised by the CIA against Castro, to kill Castro. It's a really hard thing to say definitively whether JFK ordered the assassination attempts because of the CIA practice of plausible deniability. What that means is that even if a president is informed about an assassination attempt, approves an assassination attempt, it's not put down in writing in a document. So the president's knowledge is plausibly deniable at a later point in time. So you don't see documents where Kennedy's saying, yes, go ahead and assassinate Castro. However, there is a sort of smoking gun in that investigation in the mid-1970s because part of that report showed that JFK had spoken to a journalist, a New York Times journalist, in late 1961 about the idea of assassinating Castro. And this was something the journalist wrote down in his notes at the time. It wasn't something he was remembering 14 years later. So we actually have, there was actually a note taken at the time in which Kennedy said, my intelligence people are speaking to me about assassinating Castro. And the New York Times journalist said, oh, that's a terrible idea. And then Kennedy says, oh, yeah, that is a terrible idea. It might partly explain why Kennedy went ahead with the Bay of Pigs invasion, because that's always been a mystery, the CIA operation to topple Castro using Cuban emigres. The Cuban emigre brigade that was sent to Cuba had around 1,500 Cubans, 1,500. Castro's got an army of 30,000 and he's got a militia of 200,000 that he can call up. So why did JFK think 1,500 Cubans could defeat nearly 250,000 Cubans? Well, if you assume JFK knew about the assassination attempts, that would help explain it, because at least one assassination attempt was scheduled for that time. So what JFK may have calculated is we'll send this brigade of anti-Castro Cubans into Cuba, Castro will be assassinated, eliminated, that will create political anarchy, and in that context this brigade of anti-Castro Cubans can be successful. There's one very interesting story, fascinating anecdote. Kennedy has an advisor called Richard Goodwin, who went on a conference to Uruguay in mid-1961, and during that conference he met with Castro's very close advisor, Che Guevara. And during that conference, Che Guevara gave Goodwin a present, which was a box of the best Cuban cigars. Goodwin gets back to Washington, goes to the White House, sees Kennedy, comes into the room, and Kennedy says, what have you got in your hand? And Goodwin says, I've got this box of cigars that have been given by Che Guevara. And Kennedy says, are they any good? And Goodwin says, oh yeah, they're the best. And Kennedy says, well, bring them over, puts them on the table, opens the box, takes out a cigar, cuts it, lights it, smokes it, and then Goodwin says, Kennedy sort of turned grey and said to Goodwin, you should have smoked the first one, i.e. like a Roman emperor, you make sure the servants test the food first in case it's poisoned. One of the assassination plots in the early 60s that they came up with, the CIA, was to somehow try and get a poisoned cigar to Castro. If you assume Kennedy knew that and then suddenly had the thought, if Castro's trying to do to me what we're trying to do to him, this cigar might be poisoned. Did JFK have connections to the mafia? Well, obviously he wasn't part of the mafia. It's probable that his father had to have dealings with people with connections to organised crime in his business dealings. In terms of Kennedy himself, the most significant thing is in early 1960, during the 1960 presidential campaign, he began an affair with a Californian socialite called Judith Campbell, who also had a relationship with Frank Sinatra. Sinatra introduced Campbell to Kennedy. And this is one of the really controversial aspects of the Kennedy years, the Kennedy presidency. That affair continues through until 1962, so well into the Kennedy presidency. Now, what is happening at the same time that Kennedy is sleeping with Judith Campbell, she is speaking to, spending time with Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana is head of the Chicago mafia. He's the biggest gangster in the country, and it's an extraordinary misjudgment on JFK's part that he is seeing someone who was close with the leading mafia figure in America, and whom his brother's Justice Department, Robert Kennedy's, the Attorney General, his Justice Department are trying to prosecute. This is a difficult issue because Judith Campbell wrote a memoir, she gave several interviews, she's made all sorts of allegations. She claimed that she acted as a kind of emissary between JFK and Sam Giancana, transporting letters between the two. There's speculation that maybe this was to do with the assassination of Castro, because in fact, the way in which the CIA tried to assassinate Castro was they basically hired an ex-FBI agent who in turn hired gangsters, including Giancana, to assassinate Castro. So the speculation was this correspondence with Giancana via Judith Campbell to do with assassination. I think you've got to look at that evidence very circumspectly. But nevertheless, he certainly had an affair with Judith Campbell, and she was certainly close to Sam Giancana. So there was that connection between John Kennedy on the one hand and the mafia on the other. It was a serious misjudgment on his part. Did JFK secretly record conversations in the White House? Yes, he did, at extraordinary moments. So for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had a button under his desk and he could press it and it would activate a taping system. And none of his advisors knew that he was doing that. I think with the exception of Robert Kennedy, I think he would have told his brother. But it means we have these very complete word for word verbatim records of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it allows us to have a very precise view of the way in which he handled that crisis. I think here JFK may have been thinking about history and just wanting to have a precise record of what had happened. The taping system is also significant at other moments. So 3 weeks before his own assassination, the leader of South Vietnam, Diem, the man the US has been backing as a non-communist leader of South Vietnam, been backing for a decade, is assassinated. And a few days after that happens, JFK by himself just switches on the recording device and just speaks very regretfully about what had happened and his administration's complicity in it. So yes, he taped conversations, he taped meetings, and they're a very valuable resource for historians. How did JFK die? He was assassinated in downtown Dallas on the 22nd of November 1963. He was going down to Texas to deal with different factions of the Democratic Party down there, and also to build up support in that part of the country. Remember, it's only a year out from his re-election campaign in 1964, and he wants to shore up support in Texas. But he's assassinated in downtown Dallas, 22nd of November 1963. Who killed JFK? Well, more has been written on this subject in relation to Kennedy than any other. The official view, which was articulated by the Warren Commission, which was set up by President Lyndon Johnson, was that it was a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. He himself would be shot by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, shortly after the assassination. Since then, a number of conspiracy theories have developed. The most famous was in a 1991 film by the film director Oliver Stone in a movie called JFK, where he argued that it was a government coup d'etat, that various factions within the US government, unhappy with JFK's Cold War policies and a plan to pull out of Vietnam as they saw it, arranged for the assassination of Kennedy. My own view is that it was just Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, as soon as the assassination takes place, Oswald flees from the Texas School Book Depository where he works. So that seems to be a classic case of a man on the run. Also, he goes on to shoot that day the policeman, J.D. Tippit. So again, why would he do that when a policeman stopped him? So and there's other forensic evidence as well. So my own view is that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, but an awful lot of people would disagree with that, and probably a majority of the American people. Why would someone want to kill JFK? Well, in terms of the conspiracy theories, one is that it was the mafia, and the reasoning goes like this: that there's some evidence that organised crime was involved in backing Kennedy in 1960, for example, in the West Virginia primary, and they expected favours. But in fact, when Kennedy became president, his brother, to his credit, Robert Kennedy, who's in charge of the Justice Department, he's internal Attorney General, so he deals with sort of internal security matters, law and order matters. To his credit, he tries to prosecute the mafia. So did the mafia feel stabbed in the back and therefore want to eliminate Kennedy for that reason? So there are different motivations one could attribute to different groups. Why is JFK remembered as one of the greatest presidents of all time? He is remembered as one of the greatest presidents of all time by the American people. In terms of historians, there are different views. Some rate him very highly, others don't. I think it is partly to do with his record as president. He takes a stance on civil rights. He handles the Berlin crisis 1961 very well, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 very well. He establishes the Peace Corps. He has inspirational qualities as well. I also think it's partly to do with his incredible image. I think no modern president had the kind of powerful Hollywood-style image that he did. He was a war hero. He was a sex symbol. He was seen as a man of letters. He was also seen as a symbol of the family, with this very large family and political dynasty. He was also seen as royal. There are so many elements to his image, and so I think it also reflects that, just the power of that very, very seductive, appealing image. Are the Kennedys cursed? It's often said. I mean, if you look at Kennedy's own generation, his sister Rosemary had a lobotomy on the instruction of their father, Joseph Kennedy, which went badly wrong, and she spent the rest of her life in a nursing home. JFK's favourite sister, Kathleen, Kick was her nickname, died in a plane crash. John Kennedy himself was assassinated in 1963. His brother Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968 following the California primary when running for president. Edward Kennedy, the other brother, had a plane crash but survived. And of course, John Kennedy's son, John Jr., also died in a plane crash. I don't know what being cursed means exactly, but they were incredibly, tragically unlucky as a family. A whole series of tragedies. Well, thanks very much for that. I really enjoyed it. I hope I answered all your questions. I'm Mark White. If you want to find out any more about John Kennedy, here's my book, which is just coming out, Icon, Libertine, Leader, The Life and Presidency of John F. Kennedy, where I look at the big questions. And if you enjoyed watching this, like and subscribe, and you can check out other Google questions on the screen here. Thanks very much.